acknowledge the Turrbal and Yagara traditional owners and their custodianship of the lands on which we meet today. On behalf of the University of Queensland, I pay our respects to their ancestors and their descendants who continue cultural and spiritual connections to country. We recognise their valuable contributions to Australian and global society. Good evening, everybody. I'm Professor Bronwyn Lee, head of the School of Communication and Arts, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all here this evening to this very special occasion. To honour and commemorate the life and work of Professor Lloyd Davis, who sadly passed away in 2005, UQ created this visiting professorship for leading Shakespeare scholars. Our school is committed to the long-term study of Shakespeare, and the Lloyd Davis Memorial Visiting Professorship brings a major world scholar to UQ each year to teach and share their scholarship with our Shakespeareans. Starting in 2006, this fellowship is a much-loved occasion that the school and the wider UQ community greatly look forward to every year. Sadly, due to COVID-19, in last year we had to postpone this event, and we're therefore extremely glad to be with you tonight and to continue this wonderful tradition. So I'd also like to acknowledge our honoured guest tonight, Julia Duffy, Lloyd's widow, and to thank her for her ongoing support of the Lloyd Davis Memorial Visiting Professorship. And Julia would like to say a few words. So please welcome Julia.
Thank you, Bronwyn. Welcome to everyone tonight. It's lovely to see so many friends here and also so many strangers. For you, those of you who didn't know Lloyd, and I think most people here did actually, I've just found, I went into the cupboard under the stairs and I found an obituary dated 19th of September 2005 from the Courier Mail. He repeatedly demonstrated that he was a gifted scholar pursuing research in a wide range of fields. In all, he published 7 books, including 2 in collaboration between 1988 and 2002, and 2 more will be published posthumously. He also edited ALMLA, the Journal of the Australian Universities Language and Literature Association, and for 2 years filled the role of Director of Studies in the University of Queensland Arts Faculty. He was also an exceptional teacher, winning the Australian University Humanities Teacher of the Year Award for 1999. He placed a priority on making the products of his highly original research and that of others accessible to all students, and generously supported secondary English teaching in Australia by visiting schools, presenting papers at teacher conferences, and writing articles on education for journals including English in Australia. Shortly before a brain tumour was diagnosed, he was elected head of the School of English Media Studies and Art History at the University of Queensland and elected president of the Australian and New Zealand Shakespeare Association. So he passed away in 2005 very sadly at the age of 46. After he died, I remember while he was dying, maybe my friend Robin said to me, do you think what he was doing was really important? I mean, she meant that in a generous way, and I was surprised at the vehemence of my response, and so I decided again. I found this article written by Lloyd, 3rd of September 2003 in the Australian Higher Education Supplement. I said to my daughter this morning, and there's a photo of me and Lloyd. So we used to look like Antonio Banderas and Gwyneth Paltrow in our youth. So Lloyd talks in this article why he thinks Shakespeare studies is important and performance. The headline, which I don't know if he wrote or not, is "Where there's a will, there's much ado." He writes that first, no research area should be proscribed. It is the quality as gauged by peer review, not the topic, that is the yardstick of inclusion. Second, Shakespeare is a global phenomenon. He writes that a quick check of the bibliographic database and the Modern Language Association of America revealed that from 1989 until 2003, 28,088 items have been published relating to Shakespeare. He wrote that in addressing Shakespeare's work, Australian scholars are participating in an international research community. He also talks about the meta-studies of Shakespeare. Once you've got that many articles published, why, and the interest in who really wrote Shakespeare's work, which was not one of his interests, but he found it interesting that people were interested in it. Third, he points out that Shakespeare is a dynamic part of popular culture. In a BBC radio poll in 1999, Shakespeare was declared Briton of the Millennium. And more than 350 movies had been made of his work at that stage. He has won countless Oscars, Best Picture and Best Actor in Olivier's 1948 Hamlet, a special award to Olivier for the mid-World War II Henry V, Best Costume Design for Kenneth Branagh's 1989 remake of Henry V, Best Art Direction for MGM's 1953 Julius Caesar, Best Photography for Franco Zeffirelli's 1968 Romeo and Juliet, 10 Oscars for West Side Story in 1961, and another swag of awards for Shakespeare in Love in 1998. Lloyd wrote that by including Shakespeare's work in research and teaching programs, Australian universities are able to link to and inform and in some ways lead this widespread interest. It is a means of responding and giving shape to the community's expectations and understanding of what the Academy can provide. He concluded that, quote, whatever he might represent, Shakespeare continues to play a significant role in diverse ways of producing knowledge and experience. His work's ongoing importance lies in its implication in popular, intellectual and ideological spheres of social and cultural life. This shows us, I think, that Lloyd, like all of us here today, would have been curious and excited about Rob Pensalfini's work, contributing as it does, from what I've seen of the blurb, of producing Shakespeare in prisons, or bringing Shakespeare to prisons, contributing to producing a diversity of knowledge and experience through the performance and study of Shakespeare. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Rob.
All right, thank you, Julia, for that. So for everyone who doesn't know me, I'm Dr. Jennifer Clements. And I just want to acknowledge as well that I live and work on stolen land, and that I acknowledge the authority of the elders of the Turrbal and Jagera peoples, past, present, and future. I have a little bit of housekeeping to do, so should there be an emergency, an earthquake, for example, and we have to exit immediately, we can exit from this entrance, but also there's an exit in the back. The exit to the back is also a convenient route if you should need the loo during the talk. Just go up the stairs, you'll go out the door, and the loos will be to the right. After the talk, there will be canapes after the Q&A, and we hope you'll join us then. The route to that is also up the back stairs through the door, but then you will go up another set of stairs, and the canapes will be served on a veranda. It's my great pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Rob Pensalfini, who is Associate Professor of Linguistics and Drama here at UQ, which means that he works across both the schools of languages and cultures and the School of Communication and Arts. Much to his own amazement, I think at this point, he has been working as an academic, actor, director, composer, musician, and voice and acting teacher for almost 25 years, a quarter of a century. Good Lord, Rob. In his capacity as what in my days at college we called a theater rat, Rob researches Shakespeare in Australia and theater in prison, as well as teaching practical drama skills. He is the artistic director and also one of the founders of the Queensland Shakespeare Ensemble, and has directed many plays, including Romeo and Juliet, As You Like It, Twelfth Night, The Two Gentlemen of Verona, not often staged, and The Comedy of Errors. As part of the Prison Shakespeare Project, he has directed The Tempest, Romeo and Juliet, A Midsummer Night's Dream, Julius Caesar, Macbeth, And once again, inexplicably, The Comedy of Errors. Do you actually like that play, Rob?
It's a mess.
It is a mess. As an actor, Rob has taken on a number of major roles, including Coriolanus, Benedict, Richard III, Shylock, Prospero, Titus Andronicus, that must have been fun, Feste, Falstaff, and also Macbeth. As an academic linguist, he works primarily with the indigenous languages of the Northern Territory and with formal linguistic theory. He is the author of several books on the languages of the Barclay Tableland and of the monograph Prison Shakespeare, for these deep shames and great indignities. Rob was inducted as a Queensland Cultural Champion in 2013 for his work with Indigenous languages and his contribution to Queensland theatre. We are greatly honored to have Rob with us today as the annual Lloyd Davis Memorial Fellow. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Rob Pensalfini.
Thanks. Just making sure no one's stolen my notes. Would you prefer me to use the microphone, or can you hear me perfectly well if I don't? Is that okay? Good. Just shout if you need me to go to the microphone. I would like to briefly and inadequately say something about the brief relationship that I had, professional working relationship with Lloyd Davis. We were colleagues very briefly for about 5 years. When I first came to UQ, it was then called the Department of English. It was that long ago, but not for long. And I'm not sure if it was at that time or very soon thereafter. Lloyd was called Director of Studies, which is the Director of Teaching and Learning, and the Chief Examiner for the school, which is a role that I also later went on to fill briefly in that school. And took his example. He was also instrumental, one of the architects, along with that fine dapper gentleman back there, Professor Richard Fotheringham, in getting the World Shakespeare Congress to Brisbane, which happened was 2006, wasn't it? Yeah, and that's been really important to my work because it was an opportunity. The Queensland Shakespeare Ensemble had been around only for a few years, but we were getting to that point as a professional theatre company where we could show that we had something to contribute. It was the beginning of our work in prisons, and we did several things to do with the Congress as well. Had it not been for the Congress, we might not have so soon, or perhaps ever, gotten the leg up which has allowed us to be one of Southeast Queensland's longest running independent theatre companies. But maybe even more importantly, the thing I most remember about Lloyd was at my first Australian-New Zealand Shakespeare Association conference, where I absolutely felt like a fish out of water. I was a linguist and a theatre rat, was it? Brat? Rat? Yes, fish. At this, what seemed to me to be a very erudite and very literary conference. And he just sat down, had a cup of coffee with me and had a chat, and was so kind and so supportive of the work that I was doing, and gave me a great deal of confidence. And I always just remember that kindness and supportiveness. Not everyone who has achieved as much as Lloyd did in that short time is always a kind person, and he certainly was. So the photos that you'll see in this talk, almost all, except the ones that are obviously not, are from productions by the Queensland Shakespeare Ensemble. Tempest on the left and Midsummer Night's Dream on the right. Obviously Midsummer Night's Dream, right? But I wanted to, and I will be talking about, I could have called it really re-radicalising Shakespeare, but that word is overused. But I want to sort of give another reason for the stuff that I'm going to talk about this evening, and there'll be a lot of varied stuff, and hopefully if any of it grabs your interest, please ask questions later. That's a real quote, by the way. This is in the Encyclopaedia Britannica under the definition of hubris. So it's like, how did this unrepentant radical anarchist wog kid from Perth, unfathomably stoned in that photo, in case you can't tell, become or get interested in Shakespeare and end up as the artistic director of a mostly Shakespeare company. How does that make sense? Maybe it doesn't, but let's see. So I wanted to start out talking about going back 450 odd years and talking about Shakespeare's status or Shakespeare's reception in his own time. And he was very popular among the theatre-going crowd, but not necessarily among what we might now consider his peers. And this is a very famous quote, of course, Robert Greene, and writing fairly early in Shakespeare's playwriting career, and of course in the process of lambasting Shakespeare, actually used Shakespeare to do it. Referred to him as an upstart crow, and I hope if you haven't had a chance to see the TV series Upstart Crow, written by Ben Elton, I think it's his best writing to date, and that's saying something. It's also possibly, even though it's fiction, one of the best accounts of Shakespeare's time that I've seen. Have a look at it, it's fantastic. An upstart crow beautified with our feathers, us, the real playwrights, that with his tiger's heart wrapped in a player's hide, players, ooh, dirty, filthy people, right? Supposes he's as well able to bombast out a blank verse as the best of you, and being an absolute Johannes Factotum, Johnny do everything, is in his own conceit the only Shake seen in a country. And part of it, part of the criticism of Greene and others is with, even though there was no such thing as copyright, the attitude towards borrowing other people's stories and characters, it changed a lot in the early modern period. And in the 1590s, the informal prejudice against what was seen as copying was quite strong. And Shakespeare, I would say, was markedly unoriginal in terms of his plots and his characters compared to other playwrights of the time who were all about innovation. His genius, in my opinion, was in the expression of well-known stories and their collaging, and also doing things like, oh, that's a great story there, old Roman Plautus, set of identical twins separated at birth. You know what I'll do? I'll make it 2 sets of identical twins separated at birth, and kind of making it better. He improved the well-known stories. He just told them better for a broad audience, including, and perhaps this is what pissed Greene off, although he didn't do it until much later, about 20 years later, he vastly improved Greene's novel Pandostal in writing The Winter's Tale. That was about 1610, so not quite 20 years later. Even his colleagues who loved him, you can assume Greene was not one, when they spoke highly of him, often would damn him with faint praise. So, for example, John Webster spoke of his right happy and copious industry. That's a collection of just some of my Stephen King novels. And that's what it reminded me of, to sort of slightly criticise him by talking about his copious industry. And in fact, Stephen King is often subjected to a lot of the same sorts of criticisms. Oh, he just basically has the same sorts of ideas and the same sorts of characters and just mixes and matches them in his different books. Well, that's Shakespeare too. If you take a look at, actually one of the reasons I love The Two Gentlemen of Verona, which I've actually been involved in perhaps 4 productions of. I think I've directed it twice, or plus once in prison. So 5 productions of, is that in that play, that very early play, you can kind of find the seeds of so many of Shakespeare's later plays. It's just like he had all these ideas and he just shoved them into one play, and it's a shambles. And I happen to think it's a wonderful shambles. Or Ben Jonson, who was, saying an admiring thing of him, that despite his small Latin and less Greek, it still sort of put him down for not being as thoroughly educated as the other playwrights of the time. And he did also, in a letter, conversation with William Drummond, claim that Shakespeare wanted art. make no bones about it, that translates as lacked skill. So he actually did not think that Shakespeare was a skillful playwright, which is not how we think of him today. I think of him as the Simpsons of his day. Right. What do I mean by that? I remember, I actually didn't like The Simpsons much either when I was the age that I was in that first photo. But when I started to watch The Simpsons, so I would have been in my 20s, I liked a lot of it. And then later when I was in my 40s and my offspring was very young, I loved it for different aspects of it. And my then 2-year-old loved it because the characters were yellow and funny, right? And then as we have both aged, you faster than me, mate, our appreciation for The Simpsons has grown because there are different layers and different things in it. And Shakespeare, as I'm sure you've all heard and hopefully agree, is very multi-layered. There's a lot of different things going on there at the same time. Now later in the 18th and 19th centuries, many of the puns and the low references, you know, the bawdy jokes, the dick jokes and so forth, were much reviled. And I've got a section there from Hamlet. Lady, shall I lie in your lap? No, my lord. I mean my head upon your lap. Aye, my lord. Do you think I meant country matters? Which under either of the common interpretations of that line is a rude joke, whichever way you want to look at it. That's not enough, though. I think nothing, my lord. That's a fair thought to lie between maids. Oh, another sexual pun. You know, so that's in there right alongside this wonderful to be or not to be. Oh, what a rogue and peasant slave am I. It's interwoven. And to the point where Shakespeare will actually both make an amazing philosophical or ontological observation and a dick joke at the same time. So, for example, in this line from Jaques, from As You Like It, it helps to remember... so it's talking about human life. From hour to hour we ripe, and then from hour to hour we rot, and thereby hangs a tale. There's the story of our life. Well, it maybe helps to remember that ripe can also refer to the gaining of an erection. Rot is what happens when you have syphilis. And that this probably would have been pronounced in his time as something like, and so from whore to whore we rape, and then from whore to whore we rot, and there hangs a tale, right? So he's making an amazing observation about life and a dick joke at the same time. Simpsons. Now, I said I would only give this talk if I could be assured of offending at least a few people. So I'm going to make the claim, why did I put considered in there? I meant to say Shakespeare is not literature. It's not literature at all. In the very narrow meaning of the sense, literature, that which is read, that which is written down, plays are not literature. Right? Now, of course, in a contemporary understanding of literature, anything can be a text, anything can be studied from a literary perspective. But importantly, for my point, in Shakespeare's time, plays were not considered literature. Until the 18th century, it was Shakespeare's poems that were reprinted far more than his plays were. The plays were only written down so that people could learn the lines and get up and speak them. And it's likely that a fair proportion of Shakespeare's own companies were illiterate or functionally so, given that only about half of London was literate at the time. And literate does not come up to the standards that we would consider for literacy, and that actors were not considered particularly erudite or educated. So, you know, it stands to reason that a good proportion of his company couldn't even read those things. Right? They learned them in other ways, which is something that we have experienced working in prisons. We've worked with some people who are functionally illiterate. You can't hand them a script and have them learn it, but actually not being able to read is not a barrier to being able to speak Shakespeare or to understand it. Other commentators of the time, like Francis Mears, reserved their highest praise for Shakespeare's lyric poetry, not for the plays. The plays were thought of, I would say rightly, as theatrical works, not literary works. Sir Thomas Bodley, when founding the library, the famous eponymous library at Oxford, was adamant that plays not be included. Said that, right? Some little profit might be reaped, which God knows is very little, out of some of our playbooks, but the benefit thereof will nothing near countervail the harm that the scandal will bring unto the library, when it shall be given out that we stuff it full of baggage books, and later on referred to plays as riffraffs. Right? So this is contemporaneous with Shakespeare, right? The stage doth stain pure gentle blood. So not held in high opinion, certainly not as literature were the plays. Still also contemporaneous, John Donne in 1604 or 05 compiled a list of 34 important works written by 30 writers. It included no dramatic works and no works by dramatists, dramatic or otherwise. Plays were seen as I think indeed they had, as having a continuity with the old oral culture of the Middle Ages. And certainly the establishment of the time was seeking to separate itself somewhat from that. It wasn't really until the Restoration that plays began to be thought of as literature or in literary terms. And I would point out that in the Restoration, what the theatre, the theatrical works that emerged in England were not those connected to medieval oral culture. The theatre that was brought back in England was the theatre of the French court, not the theatre of the French street, right? Which was, in fact, the jongleurs, the commedia style stuff, which was connected to that medieval oral culture. At this point, people did begin to think of plays in potentially literary terms. And so, what began to happen was that people either made excuses for Shakespeare, as in Alexander Pope's quote here, it's the preface to the collected works of Shakespeare in 1725, almost not apologising, but saying, look, I know you all think Shakespeare made lots of mistakes and wasn't a great literary artist, but players are just such judges of what is right as tailors are of what is graceful. And in this view, it would be fair to allow that most of our author's faults are less to be ascribed to his wrong judgment as a poet than to his right judgment as a player. So Pope was reminding us that these are plays, and that as Shakespeare was an actor, sometimes the things that look like mistakes in poetic or literary terms are actually good theatre. There's one example I often use, because editors have been correcting these mistakes, and some of them are genuine mistakes, for centuries. My favourite, as in least favourite, is one of Romeo's lines, which in the early texts is a single 16-syllable line, which almost all editors have corrected to a 10-syllable line followed by a 6-syllable line. Now, I'm not going to get into the whole theory about speaking dramatic verse, but essentially, in my opinion, they've taken something that is an outburst of emotional energy, an overwhelm, a racing heart, and turned it into something sort of staid, more manageable, with a big pause in it. Right. I imagine these editors having tweed jackets with leather patches, or is it the other way around? I never know. And coming a bit later, this quote here, so that's sort of excusing Shakespeare and saying you've got to understand why. But once we get to the 20th century, his distinction as minister... Oh, sorry, wrong Tom Hardy. His distinction as a minister of the theatre is infinitesimal besides his distinction as a poet. So now he is a poet. By this stage, we kind of have to accept that Shakespeare is a major figure in English writing, acting, theatre. There's my first typo. his expression of himself was cast in the form of words for actors and not in the form of books to be read, was an accident of his social circumstances that he himself despised. In other words, if he'd been born into the right class, he would have written books, not plays, right? That he himself despised. How presumptuous. I mean, I've been trying for 25 years by performing and studying and all that Shakespeare's plays. I have no idea what Shakespeare thought about anything. Nothing. You cannot tell from what he's written what his opinion of anything at all is, right? Except that he seemed to like plays. But not if Tom Hardy was right. Yeah. And then this person is not present in the room, I just need to tell you. I don't go to see the plays, they're always better in my head. The productions always get it wrong. I'm glad you're laughing because this was a serious statement. Yeah, no more to be said about that. So, when Shakespeare becomes literature, his connection to the theatre is either reviled or pushed aside in many ways. And unfortunately, what that means is in production, things either become relegated to high culture or ignored entirely. Can't get funding to do a Shakespeare play. Or deverbalised. Because what's happened, of course, is that we've come to this idea now that Shakespeare is high literature. You may not have that idea, but it's broadly enshrined culturally that it's high literature, that it's hard, that it's elite. It's been consigned to the dustbin of elitism. And so it's either done as high culture for very refined people, or people run away from it because, like I did back in that first photo in the 90s, I was 27 before I decided that I actually liked Shakespeare. Which was not quite half a lifetime ago, but we're getting there. So here are what I think are some unhelpful notions in terms of restoring Shakespeare to his rightful place as the Simpsons of his day and possibly our day, versus some helpful notions. So I want to talk about this notion of universality or universalism, this idea that Shakespeare wrote about the universal human condition. I don't believe that's true. I also don't care. I don't think it's relevant, right? Because it was something that was decided by a very narrow subsection of society. It was a lot of middle, and upper class, mostly men, almost entirely white people going, look, he's writing about what all human beings experience. How do you know? How do you know? I don't know. Now, it may be true that most people that I've encountered can connect to something in Shakespeare, but what they're connecting to is not necessarily what I'm connecting to. And I wouldn't want to presume it to be so. I wouldn't want to presume that I've got it right in my head and they've got it wrong in theirs, or in their mouths, or in their bodies. I prefer to think of it in terms of what my friend Tariq Jenkins of the Independent Theatre Movement of South Africa said, which is that the power, and here he was sort of paraphrasing Nelson Mandela, and I point out that this is the opposite of what Steve Biko believed, that it's about putting the words of the oppressor into the mouths of the oppressed, not because they will have the same experience, but because that is a powerful act. And that's some of the stuff that Robert Greene was opposed to. How dare this upstart crow, this son of a glove maker with his mere equivalent to high school education, come in here and act, not only act but write for our stages. Yeah, individualism. So a lot of writers, and thinking of Harold Bloom as perhaps the most preeminent, talked, Shakespeare invented the human. What? Insisting on seeing, or Bloom in particular insists on seeing what I would consider to be the most antisocial characters in Shakespeare as the most human, right? Falstaff, he adores. So do I. I played the role. I love playing the role. Would I want to hang out with him? No way. What an asshole. Right? He just sends his poor soldiers off to death, right? And he has clearly has a massive crush on the character of Rosalind, as do most people. Gaslighting narcissist. A horrible, horrible character. Don't treat the person you love the way that she does. It's not a nice thing to do. But this idea that Shakespeare, and I think it's almost become gospel, that Shakespeare's works champion the individual. And I think I used to think that too. The problem with that is that the characters are seen as somehow complete in and of themselves, rather than part of a system. I've started to experience the plays now as not being about individuals, but really being about society and social roles and social structures and different ways of operating within that. I think that Shakespeare asks 3 questions constantly. Other writers probably do too. And they are this universal, if you will, question, or a question, almost spiritual question: what does it mean to be alive? That any of us can ask, and it's answered in so many different ways. But then within the context of that, where do I fit? And this goes back to Aristotle's, I hope it was Aristotle, know thyself, which was explained to me, not the way that many people interpret it, which is, navel gaze and know yourself, but was explained to me that what was meant at the time that it was written was know yourself where you fit. Not know your place and stay there, but rather know how you fit in. So that second question Shakespeare asks is, how do we treat each other? How do we belong together? And that, I think, is what Shakespeare's characters are seeking. Not an expression of their individualism, but how do we treat one another? And then and only then, the individual question of, what must I do? And it's never divorced from the whole, from the context. When you do divorce that, when you insist on seeing Shakespeare's characters as expressions of individualism, right, you start to see things in terms of heroes and villains. And I would argue that there is not one single hero and not one single villain in Shakespeare's plays. Not in the storybook, the fairy tale, two-dimensional sense. So, come on, Richard III, he's a villain. And yet Shakespeare can't write a villain without giving him justification, not by way of excusing him, but by way of understanding. We understand why Richard III's, right? We meet his mum. We hear what his mum says about him. We understand why Aaron in Titus Andronicus, arguably the most cardboard cutout of all villains, is that way. It's placed very clearly in terms of racial, ethnic and class contexts. Some people have suggested that in writing Shylock, which is another of my favourite characters that I've played, Shakespeare really, really tried to write a cartoon villain, but just failed. As I said, I don't know what was going on in Shakespeare's head. But it's the way in which every thought and every action is unpacked verbally, textually, that doesn't exist. Shakespeare's heroes. Name a Shakespeare hero. Oh, Henry V. War criminal. Hamlet. Hamlet? Are you serious? It occurred to me that Hamlet and Othello would be much shorter plays if you took the title characters and swapped them, right? So, Othello, right, in Hamlet. Revenge my murder. Okay. End of play. Hamlet in Othello. I'm not sure that that's true. Let me find out. Oh, it's not true. Go away. Right? It'll be very short plays. So they work well because of the structures they're in. And even in those plays that are very oriented towards a single character, like, say, Hamlet, who has a lot of the lines in that play, you are given many perspectives on him and his actions. You see how what he does affects the people around him. It's, I think, very sad that one of the scenes that are often cut from productions of Hamlet are the ones involving the king, which some people call Claudius, though he's never really called that. I think he is in the Dramatis Personae, but that's it. And the Norwegian ambassadors. You actually see that for all the horrible things that Claudius did, he was probably the best king for that country at that time. And what does Hamlet do in his dying breath? Gives the country away to the enemy. Well done, Hamlet. What a hero. So, yeah, I'm not convinced about that. Okay, the bard. I hate that phrase. To me, its epithet reeks of elitism because it identifies William Shakespeare only to those already in the know. Right? The bard. I love the bard. What? You play Dungeons and Dragons? I play Dungeons and Dragons too. I had a bard once. I had an 8th level bard. Yeah, it's just, I don't like it. And it's fine if you do. Just know that I don't. So now everyone's going to come up to me and say the bard, just to piss me off, and I deserve it. And finally, this thing. And Richard and I, many years ago, did some work looking at the pronunciation of Shakespeare in the Australian age. There it says received pronunciation. On my notes it says that fucking accent. For some reason, and I don't know what the reason is, it's conventionalism. It's not historicism. But it has become enshrined in Australia long after it stopped anywhere else in the world that Shakespeare must be spoken in a refined British accent. Unless, of course, you played one of the low-class characters, in which it's still a British accent, but it's what, right? Accents which did not exist at the time the plays were written. Did not exist and would not come into existence for several hundred years. So they cannot be the way that those words were meant to or intended to be spoken. I remember asking a very well-known, on famous TV soapies, Australian actor, young man, probably about 30 at the time, who was playing the Scottish king. So a play about Dark Ages Scotland, written in early modern London by a Warwickshire man, played in 21st century Australia by a young half-Chinese Australian, where he came out and did the role in received pronunciation, which is not the accent of the character, it's not the accent of the time it was written, or the person who wrote it, or when it's set, or the people in the show, or the people watching the show. And I said, why? And he said, that's the way you're supposed to do Shakespeare. And it persists in Australia. The English have stopped doing this. You know, and much was made of a production of Much Ado About Nothing, where John Bell directed it, I believe, 1971, Nimrod Theatre. Thank you. Just check in. Where, oh my God, they're using Australian accents. What were they doing? They were using the greengrocer accent. I'm a stupid Italian man. It is still a battle to get actors to just speak general Australian. And I'm not saying we should, let's do plays in broad Australia. You absolutely can. But the Australian accents, all of them, are as capable of being heightened and low in every other class as any other accent. And yet people resist this within Australia. We even once had a critic say, I believe the Australian accent is fine, but it's just not suitable to heightened verse. It's like playing a Mozart clarinet concerto on a 3-hole fife. He was not born in Australia, but yeah. Yeah, that was interesting. Cool. So, I spoke before, and this sort of gone off the screen there, but the helpful notions, apart from that one there, speaking Shakespeare in your own voice, your own accent, but also what you get out of it when you speak it. What do you connect to? What does it remind you of? And this takes it out of the hands of a correct interpretation or a correct way of saying it. That's an ad for one of the courses we run every year. It's called Speaking Shakespeare in Your Own Voice, which is not about accent. It's actually about finding where you, the actor, and the text intersect and using that as the genesis, as the beginning. You may then go on to, add character, add voices, add accents and so on, but that's the beginning. And I'll read these now. Just to just exemplify what I think is the value of what I will call marginal interpretations, I'll just tell 3 little anecdotes. So there's this first speech, one on the left, and I haven't put it all there, but I might read the whole thing, is Richard II. Towards the end of the play, he's had his crown whipped off him, and he's sitting in solitary confinement in the Tower of London, which is probably not where kings were when they were in the Tower of London. They had apartments, but whatever. Shakespeare had to tell a good story. And we say everyone can connect to this, right? Everyone. You may not have been a king, but you've had something and then lost it. So what Shakespeare does is puts it under a microscope or in a pressure cooker. Says, person who has something then has nothing. Let's make it a king who believes in absolute divine right to rule, who is in solitary confinement. Pushes us out to the extremes. And this is often spoken of as being an amazing, wise, insightful speech. And, you know, in many ways, and I think it actually is, I often think of it as including one of Shakespeare's Zen moments. I think he has 3 or 4 moments of nirvana in his writing. Prospero's, we are such stuff as dreams are made on, being another. Okay, so this is what Richard says while he's sitting in the prison. I've been studying how I may compare this prison where I live unto the world. And because the world is populous and here is not a creature but myself, I cannot do it. Yet I'll hammer it out. My brain I'll prove the female to my soul the father, and these two beget a generation of still breeding thoughts. And these same thoughts people this little world in humours like the people of the world, for no thought is contented. The better sort, as thoughts of things divine, are intermixed with scruples, and do set the word itself against the word, as thus, come, little ones. And then again, it is as hard to come as for a camel to thread the postern of a small needle's eye. Thoughts tending to ambition, they do plot unlikely wonders, how these vain, weak nails may tear a passage through the flinty ribs of this hard world, my ragged prison walls, and for they cannot die in their own pride. Thoughts tending to content flatter themselves that they are not the first of fortune's slaves, nor shall not be the last, like silly beggars who, sitting in the stocks, refuge their shame that many have and others must sit there, and in this thought they find a kind of ease, bearing their own misfortunes on the back of such as have before endured the like. Thus play I in one person many people, and none contented. Sometimes am I king, then treasons make me wish myself a beggar, and so I am. Then crushing penury persuades me I was better when a king. And then I'm kinged again, and by think that I am unkinged by bowling broke, and straight am nothing. But whate'er I be, nor I nor any man that but man is, with nothing shall be pleased till he be eased with being nothing. Right? Wow. Very insightful. So when we did this, introduced this speech to a group of men in a high security men's prison, because we thought, oh, they'll be able to relate to that, right? And they absolutely could. And their response was, he's doing his time hard. I'm like, what? And they're like, this is the wrong way to go about being in prison. You can sit in prison and have thoughts like this, and your time will go by slowly. And you can be wondering about what's going on outside. And you can be paranoid that your missus is doing the dirty with your best mate and so on. And you will be miserable. Or you can forget all that. Just do your time and get out. And we're like, but no, this erudite, it's very... No, they weren't having a bar of it. Were they wrong? Absolutely not. It's a different perspective. It's not the perspective of the people that write the books about Shakespeare, of the people who make claims about universal themes. Right, another one from the prison, this famous one from the Scottish play. Is this a dagger which I see before me? The handle toward my hand? Come, let me clutch thee. I have thee not, yet I see thee still. Art thou not fatal vision, sensible to feeling as to sight, or art thou but a dagger of the mind? A false creation proceeding from the heat oppressed brain. All right, I won't do the rest of that one. But I was working with one man in prison in particular, and he went, oh, this is me. This is my story. Right? And what it turned out that it meant to him was that he, in his own words, the reason he was in prison was for bashing a pedophile. And the night that he did it, he didn't literally see a dagger, in the air, but he sat and he went through this thought process in which he concluded that he had no option. He had to do this. It was the right thing to do, which is a take on the Scottish play that I think is fascinating and very different from any that I've seen on a professional stage or heard. The third one is from Henry IV, Part 1, and it's Hotspur. And it's just way too much fun not to read. So this is, Hotspur has been accused by the king of withholding prisoners. Is that right? You were in that scene? Yeah. You were in that scene, weren't you, Douglas? I was in the pub being drunk and fat. And he's trying to excuse himself before the king as to why he did this, right? And he says to the king, "But I remember when the fight was done, when I was dry with rage and extreme toil, breathless and faint, leaning upon my sword, came there a certain lord, neat and trimly dressed, fresh as a bridegroom, and his chin new reaped showed like a stubble land at harvest home. He was perfumed like a milliner, and twixt his finger and his thumb he held a pouncet box, which ever and anon he gave his nose and took away again, which therewith angry, when it next came there, took it in snuff. And still he smiled and talked, and as the soldiers bore dead bodies by, he called them untaught knaves, unmannerly, to bring a slovenly, unhandsome course betwixt the wind and his nobility. With many holiday and lady terms he questioned me, among the rest demanded my prisoners in your majesty's behalf. I then, all smarting with my wounds being cold, to be so pestered with a popinjay, out of my grief and my impatience, answered neglectingly, I know not what he should or he should not, for he made me mad to see him shine so brisk and smell so sweet and talk so like a waiting gentlewoman of guns and drums and wounds, God save the mark! And that it was great pity, so it was, this villainous saltpetre should be digged out of the bowels of the harmless earth, with many a good tall fellow had destroyed so cowardly, and but for these vile guns, he would himself have been a soldier. This bald, unjointed chat of his, my lord, I answered indirectly, as I said, and I beseech you, let not his report come current for an accusation betwixt my love and your high majesty. And, I think this talks a lot about those who actually experience battle and those who have theories about it. And one of my other favourite poets, Wilfred Owen, is someone who wrote about it very eloquently and experienced it. He was an officer. And of course, Hotspur is an officer. He's effectively a general. He's a lord, right? And so we kind of think of it, okay, is that it's the fighting lord versus the stay-at-home lord who makes excuses. But we were doing a workshop a few years ago through Mates for Mates, which is an organisation for members and former members of the armed services, particularly with post-traumatic stress. And we were doing a Shakespeare workshop. And one of the service folk was working on this speech, and we were all discussing it. And they saw in it not quite that. They actually saw the fop who's described as a commissioned officer. So they actually saw it as the enlisted person, commissioned officer divide, and explored it from that perspective. Again, not at all wrong, and really valuable to have all these different perspectives and insights, I think. And it really opens it up, makes it more like The Simpsons. All right, so I suppose I should say something, since I promised to, about the Queensland Shakespeare Ensemble, which was founded in 2001, and there's a few members of the ensemble and former... No, it's the Ensemble California you can check out, but you can't ever leave. Members of our ensemble here today. What are we? Well, we're an ensemble that mostly does Shakespeare in Queensland. Go figure. A few things that characterise our work. We're ensemble-centred, we're actor-centred, not director-centred. We have directors. I'd love to actually do a show without a director sometime, see how that works. We train together. When we're not performing together, we train together. We share a body of training, of understanding. not because our training is better than all the rest, which of course it is, but rather so that we have a common working language from which to create. We are really interested in the multiplicity of viewpoints as a result of that. I got interested in Shakespeare only after I'd become interested in ensemble theatre, which was only after I had become hyper-political as a kind of a, well, all right, I used to be the National Secretary of the National Organisation of Labour Students, but then I resigned from the Labour Party in disgust when they took away free education, boo, in 1988. And from then, I have continued to drift further and further to the left, to the point where I would have said before an unrepentant anarchist. I'm more of a mutualist now, and that's largely informed by my work with ensembles and Shakespeare. And I think Shakespeare is a terrible vehicle for directors. It's a wonderful vehicle for ensembles, because if you get one issue, 3 characters, you've got at least 6 different viewpoints on that stage, right? And to privilege one, to have that single point perspective, to privilege one, I think is diminishing to the texts themselves. We practice what some people would call non-traditional casting, which we should really say non-conventional casting, because traditional casting would be men playing everything, right? You'd have 40-year-old Richard Burbage playing Romeo. That's not what we usually mean when we say traditional. What people mean is that the actor somehow demographically matches the character role. We don't do that. We go beyond that. We just recently closed a season of Romeo and Juliet with a woman playing Romeo and a woman playing Mercutio, and playing Mercutio as essentially non-binary. Romeo was definitely male, but was clearly being played by a woman. And that just didn't seem to be an issue, even for audiences. Like, they got over it after about the 2nd minute of the show. Because remember, these plays were written for men, as it were. So we also have expanded that in recent times to looking at non-traditional audiences. So we're really, really interested. I sometimes, a little bit tongue-in-cheek, say we're the Shakespeare company for people who don't go to the theatre, in that we actively reach out to populations and communities that don't have a history of going to the theatre, or don't have a history of access to the theatre, and particular to Shakespeare. We're very interested in the physicality of language. That is, we go word to body, not word to brain. So we insist that we experience saying the words out loud, noticing what happens in our bodies, and only then do we intellectualise, do we talk about what it means. We don't sit around and do table work where we analyse the script first. We do heaps of analysis, but it's all on our feet. It's all from a visceral, embodied perspective. Insert something about Merleau-Ponty. We also do not only Shakespeare and other classical plays, but we also have a very strong sideline in plays of local historical cultural interest. So, for example, we did a verbatim play about Boggo Road Jail in the 1970s and 80s, compiled from the oral histories collected by a historian trained at UQ, of oral histories from people who had either worked or lived in Boggo Road Jail in the 70s and 80s. And essentially it was about Queensland in the 70s and 80s, in the Bjelke-Petersen years, but as seen through that microcosm of Boggo Road. For the 100th anniversary of the end of World War I, we did a play researched by historians here at UQ, written by Michael Futcher, about the conscription debates, and stuff that I never got taught this stuff at school. I thought the entire country was united behind the war effort and rah, rah, rah. I thought that Australian soldiers fought under the Australian flag. What an idiot. None of that happened. The country was almost torn apart by those who supported the empire and its efforts in the war, and those who did not want Australia to fight the empire's war. So we do plays of that sort, and a few others. Yeah. Also, and you'll see this from some of the photos, just some general training photos. You can see some of the physicality there in that those performance shots. We go for an ambience that says this is not high culture. This is culture and it's fun, but we kind of even break down some of the rules of going to the theatre. So for our outdoor shows, we have, those aren't outdoor shows. Sorry, I'll come to that in a second. Don't look at that. For our outdoor shows, we have a live band that plays before the show for half an hour in the intermission and provides incidental music. And that band is made up of a subset of the actors in the show. We go back and forth between the band and the stage as needs be. Sometimes the band is actually on the stage rather than to the side, so it's sort of front and centre, or back and centre. We perform, when we do our outdoor shows, we perform in the Roma Street Parkland Amphitheatre. We have done since 2007, but we do it backwards. So the audience sits on the stage with us 3/4 round, and so there's great intimacy. The audience and the actors are very close, but the audience is looking out into the amphitheatre, into the tiered seating in the park. So there's also the scope of the outdoor, and sometimes we set stuff back there. We don't have a curtain, and it's not because we can't afford one. But we really seek to, and you could say, well, that is traditional in a sense, Shakespearean, the 3/4 round. I like to think of it as the audience embracing the playing space. Okay, so here are some, just a couple of examples from our many shows. In 2005, we did a regendered version of The Comedy of Errors, your favourite play. Now, what do I mean by regendered? And we only found out after the fact that this appears to have been the world's first fully regendered production. We didn't just cross-cast, we changed the gender of every character in the play. 2 sets of twins, Antiphola and Antiphola, and Dromia and Dromia. And one of the Antipholae was married to, I'm going to get this wrong, Adriano, who has a brother, Luciano. And actually, Bronwyn, you said the most wonderful thing after this production, if I may quote you. You said you were almost giddy in seeing women's bodies and women characters doing such a wide range of things. Sword fighting, dealing, all the kinds of things that have normally been considered male actions. And this is one of the things that our Romeo this year said about playing Romeo, that it's very rare, even with contemporary text, contemporary plays, for a woman to have an opportunity to do those sorts of things on stage, to explore those parts of herself. So what we found with this production is that, of course, as we expected, it really highlighted the gender politics in the play. Oh, I should say, we didn't do this because no one had done it before. The reason we did it, ensemble, was we had 2 actors in the company who, from afar or from behind, were constantly being mistaken for each other. And we had 2 other actors who looked quite similar. So I thought, well, we have to do Comedy of Errors. I don't care if it's a terrible play. That's the play we have to do, because those are the actors we have. That's what it means to be an ensemble, to work from what you've got. And it just so happened that those 4 actors were women. So were we going to cross-cast it? And then I started thinking of this idea, and it was a bit of a challenge for me as a linguist to change the language minimally without disturbing the structure of the verse, or, if you know this play at all, it is full of rhyming couplets. Mother, the line ends, mother, father, they almost rhyme. Yeah, that's good, great, no problem. So that's easy, right? Brother, sister doesn't rhyme, So trying to maintain the integrity of the verse, changing the pronouns, doing all that sort of stuff. We had, instead of Duke Solinus, well, it would have made sense to have Duchess Solina. Sorry, that's going to wreck the verse. So it was Queen Solina, same number of syllables. And the Duke in that play is the absolute pinnacle of temporal power. There is no one higher than that Duke. So it was okay to have a queen, right, rather than a duchess, etc. And yes, this was this year's non-binary romantic Romeo and Juliet. As you can see, there's Romeo in the bite my thumb leather jacket. Romeo and Tybalt having a go at each other with swords, Mercutio in the pink and black jacket there, and I just had to include the nurse getting her back rubbed because it's such a delicious moment, I think. And because you probably expect me to, I'll say something about the Shakespeare Prison Project. So what do we do? What is the Shakespeare Prison Project? Well, a team of artists, team of our artists, actors of the company usually, mostly, usually a team of 4, mostly women because that's who wants to do it, go into a high security prison. We've worked in both men's and women's. More recently, we've also worked in juvie. That's a slightly different project. And we're expanding that out now to at-risk youth in the community. We're doing a project with Brisbane Youth Services. Those are smaller projects. But the adult prison, high security prison projects run for 3 to 4 months, at the end of which the prisoners who volunteer, there is no being sentenced to Shakespeare. It's not like when I went to high school. They put on a play, a production. It's cut down. It's usually anywhere between sort of 70 and 90 minutes cut of a Shakespeare play. For an audience, there's several audiences now. There's an audience that has friends and family from the outside of the performers and fellow inmates who are invited by the individual performers. And then there are a couple of public performances, which I know some of you folks have been to. Thank you. We appreciate your custom. And it's gotten a lot of attention initially in the press, but also in academic writing, where around the world, Shakespeare in prison or prison Shakespeare is kind of a big thing. Ours is the only ongoing such project in Australia. There have been others that have done like 1 or maybe 2 seasons, but ours has been going since 2006. And it seems to be quite powerful in a number of ways. And I would argue that we're not doing anything different, and the outcomes are no different than they would be for anyone doing a Shakespeare play. It's just that we're doing it in this place that is anathema to a Shakespeare play. So I'd like to talk about the prisoner's condition. Shame is the constant ongoing condition of the prisoner. You walk into a high security prison, you smell shame. Someone suggested that all I was smelling was a boys' locker room, but you can smell it in women's prisons as well. The environment is one to be survived. When you're in survival mode, you're relying on what you know works. For all the talk of growth and rehabilitation, the environment itself mitigates against that. You are in survival mode. You're in fight or flight. Every moment that you're in there, you're not going to try putting new things at work. This beautiful quote by a man who did several of our projects, that the only emotion you're allowed to show in there is anger, and even then you have to be very circumspect about it. The rehabilitative programs, and I have a problem with the concept of rehabilitation for a number of reasons, but the way that it operates in the Australian prison system is that the focus is entirely on behavioural choices. And then the way it's delivered is bizarre, right? It's supposed to be cognitive behaviour therapy based, but it's very watered down. It's a course that you do that is delivered by someone who is not a therapist. And at the end, you get a tick-a-box test. And because a lot of people in prison are very clever and creative, there are cheat sheets going around the prison telling you what to put in the test. But that's all you have to do. You have to do these 4 courses and then you can go up for parole. They don't work. And the thing is that the people at the higher levels of the prisons, the directors of the prisons, know that and will tell you that happily, that they do not work. Right. Part of the thing is, I think I realised this when I went a couple of years ago to Port Arthur, and the guide was telling us about the discipline and punish. That discipline and punish was the spoken ideology of the correctional system at the time. And now the rhetoric has shifted to rehabilitate and educate. But they're the same institutions. We haven't actually altered the physical material or many of the conditions of the institutions themselves. Just changing the words from discipline and punish to educate and rehabilitate does not make it so. And the context is not conducive to that. So why is a project like this conducive to that? Because it creates a little bubble, a little space, and this is what we're told by the people that do it. We're told when I come to Shakespeare, as they call it, that's the only time I actually feel like myself when I'm in here. So when you come to this thing where you get to play a different character, that's when you feel like yourself. Why? Because prisoner is a costume, it is a mask, it is a role. And in order to play any other role, you have to take that one off first. And we play games, and we sit in a circle. There's not a classroom set up. I'm getting ahead of myself a little here. The thing I like, probably the reason I do this work, is because it takes that which has been deemed to be the height of our culture, Shakespeare, and those who are deemed to be the lowest and least worthy of our culture, and sticks them in the same room. And I like that, because I'm perverse. So what are some of these outcomes? Some of it actually comes from simply doing that thing, that you flip the curse of Shakespeare's elite status. And people say things like, this is meant to be hard, but I can do it. Right? Here are some of the outcomes very quickly. And these first few have actually been studied by a public health scholar, has done whatever public health scholars do with our project, that it helps people to develop support structures, which is something that is not encouraged in prison. What, collaborate with other prisoners? No, thank you. Right? But to do a Shakespeare play, guess what you have to do? Collaborate with other people. Or any play, really. That it develops communication skills, particularly around affect, particularly around emotion. And remember that quote that you're not allowed to express emotions in prison. And these two, in particular, are seen in the public health literature as social determinants of health and well-being. When you have well-being, you have these things. When you don't have these things, it is very hard, if not impossible, to have well-being. Increased empathy. People say things like, oh, I actually began to feel the hurt that I had caused by playing these silly games and being in these different roles. And on that, this one too. That's obvious. If you play any character, you have to get inside the psychology of the character. I was in Rome in Rebibbia prison working with Fabio Cavalli. The Taviani brothers made a kind of arty docudrama about his work called Caesar Must Die. After seeing that, I sought him out and went over there and worked with him. And I was talking to a guy who'd been doing Julius Caesar for 4 years, and he'd played like 4 different roles. And I said, aren't you bored of this play? And he's like, no. I'm like, why are you still doing it? He said, because every time I get in play a new character, I have to speak that character's words, which means I have to think that character's thoughts, which means I get a new way of looking at the world. Simple, right? This is no different to anyone else doing a Shakespeare play, but it's not the kind of stuff that normally goes on in a prison context. Interrogation of values. Yeah, we all know this. And this too, my heart was broken when one of the men in one of our projects said after a production that his family had come to see, he said, you know, Rob, that's the first time in my life my mum has ever seen me do anything good. Mind-blowing, right? That simple. Being seen positively. These are shots from, they're not badly photographed. You cannot, by Queensland law, show photos that would identify high security prisoners. So their heads are deliberately cut off or blurred out or whatever. The top right one is from the women's prison, something you can tell. This gets reported all the time, being treated as equals. Which is why I think it's important that this sort of project never become part of official prison programming, because then it's going to be delivered by people in blue uniforms, and that won't happen. And this actually, it's the last one on the list, I think, but to me it's, in a sense, the most important. People are always asking me, how does this, what does this do for the prisoners? Does it make them better people? Does it stop them offending? And if I'm honest, my answer to that is, I don't care. I do it for these other reasons, which may or may not lead to that. I mean, there's some cynical people who say, if a prisoner develops better self-esteem, all you get is a more confident prisoner. Thank you, cynicus. But that there's a ripple, that people come in to see the shows, or staff working in the prison that go, staff might go, how did you get him to do that? I didn't know he could do that. Or people from the general public will say, I didn't expect it to be that good, right? Which is great, but that brings you face to face with your assumptions about who a prisoner is and who ends up in prison. And this thing that we are fed constantly in the media, that there's a different kind of person that ends up in prison. And anyone who's worked in a prison, the first thing that hits you in the face is, you're just like me. Right. With different opportunities or no opportunities, and maybe a couple of bad decisions, or as I like to tell them, you got caught, I didn't. I'll be quick because we're running low on time, but there is actually a history to this. I guess the most important things... the Robben Island Bible is an interesting historical side note. That's Robben Island was where the ANC prisoners in South Africa were held for many, many years, and they were not allowed any books except for religious texts. So Sunny Venkataran disguised a collection of Shakespeare's collected works, a book, as a Sanskrit holy book, and it was circulated among the prisoners, who many of them underlined their favourite passages and put their initials next to it. Mandela's was something by Brutus. Which one was it? I don't remember. Not one of the really obvious ones. So it goes back. I like to think, and this is very tongue-in-cheek because there's no evidence for this whatsoever, that prison Shakespeare started in Australia. I like to think this because we know that there were convict theatre companies in the early 1800s. And we know that what they were producing was the sort of stuff that was seen on the stage in London at that time. And people were doing Shakespeare in London on the stage at that time. So it stands to reason that there must have been some convicts, but there's absolutely no evidence that that ever happened. Right? But let's pretend it did and say we invented it. There's a question around doing Shakespeare in prisons, which is, are we just enabling the problematic correctional structures? And there are people who work in advocacy work, like Sisters Inside, who won't even basically talk to us because they're like, we're not interested in programming in prisons, we want to shut all prisons down. Which, fine, but in the meantime, what about the people that are in there now? That's my response. Then there's these two questions that I don't really know the answer to. Is Shakespeare special? You answer that for yourself. Could this be something else? Could you go in there and do Ben Jonson plays? Maybe. There are programs where the prisoners write their own plays and perform them. Those are the sort that tend to get shut down very quickly, which is where, and Shakespeare was brilliant at this too, right? He wants to write a play about what's going on in early modern England. He doesn't set it in early modern England. He sets it in ancient Rome, or he sets it 300 years earlier, or in a magical island somewhere, right? Aesthetic distance. So if there is something special, the aesthetic distance, and the starkest example I saw of this was in our very first prison production, a man playing Caliban in The Tempest, who was actually the guy who said the thing about only being able to express anger and having to be very... When he came to the front of the stage, Caliban, and he looked right at the guards who were sitting together and said, "This island's mine, by Sycorax my mother, and here you stye me in this rock and keep from me the rest of the island." And there was no artifice or pretense about what he was saying. It was real. He was speaking his truth. And the guards had no choice but to applaud because it was bloody good, right? And he could always do... Augusto Boal tells the story that he believes that theatre was invented, theatre as we understand it, by Thespis, who was so rotten drunk on the day of the parade that as the dithyrambic parade was dithyrambling by the Duke, he stumbles out of the parade and delivers this hysterical diatribe about everything that's wrong with the Athenian state, right to the Duke's face. And everyone was in hysterics, and the Duke had to politely applaud. And afterwards, the Duke went up to him and said, "You know, that's very funny, you're very clever, you're very talented, but you really want to be careful what you say about my regime." And Thespis said, "Me? Oh, that was my character." And the aesthetic distance is very powerful in that regard. Is the prison context special? Yes, I think so, for the reasons that I've said. Here's some of the other stuff we do as a company, just to finish off. I talked about we're trying to reach non-traditional, if you will, audiences. Relaxed performances are something that we've been doing for the last 4 or so years, where one of our matinees is set aside, so are some of the chairs, and occasionally replaced by beanbags. We couldn't do that this year. Ticketed seating, COVID, masks, all that, right? And we break all the rules of going to the theatre. This is particularly aimed at isn't the right word, but particularly accessible to people with sensory processing challenges or who are on the autism spectrum. Before the play starts, the actors come out and stand there. We're the actors, we're going to play this. Some of us play several roles. You'll be able to tell we wear different hats. Right? Yep, there's some fighting. It's not real. The blades aren't sharp. There is no stage blood anyway, but if there was, it wouldn't be real. We turn the amplifiers, very Elizabethan amplifiers, right? We turn them down a notch. We encourage people to be on their devices, to talk to each other, to shout out during the show. We have a chill-out room where if things get a bit much, they can leave the auditorium and go sit in the chill-out. We have colouring in, we have fidget spinners, we have little bubble wrap that you can sit there and pop, right? We basically say all those things you've been taught about how to be an audience member, don't do that, don't worry about that. Just, yeah. Which, I guess in a sense, as someone pointed out to me, is probably more like what it was like going to the theatre in Shakespeare's day. We do not provide oranges to throw at the actors. But if people want to bring their own, actors are starving, right? We'll appreciate the oranges. And then the other thing we do through our community partners, who at the moment are AFME Queensland Communify and the Red Cross, is we have something called a night at the theatre, where when our patrons buy tickets to our show, which are very cheap by professional theatre standards, you can have 3 people go see one of our shows for what it will cost you to see one QTC show. Yes, I know they're not called that anymore, but to me they are. Queensland Theatre. Pretentious name. They can buy another ticket to be given to our community partners who then distribute them to their clientele. And these are often people who are transitioning out of homelessness, who have challenges with drug and with substance addiction, with at risk. There are at-risk communities. And so many people come to our shows through this program and others, and many of them will say, I've never seen a Shakespeare play before. Did you understand it? Not all the words, but I understood the story. Good. Probably Shakespeare's audience didn't understand all the words either. Doesn't matter. You understood the story, good on you. Or we get people who, remarkably, I have never been to the theatre before. Right? And that's exactly the sort of thing that we're interested in reaching. There I am. Smoking a pretend pipe this time, not a real one, in Romeo and Juliet. Hopefully we have time for questions. I know I've rabbited on, I tend to do that, but how do we do this? Do I just point at people? Oh, Olivia's got a microphone, thank you.